Listeners, this week we're kicking off a new Editors Roundtable segment of the Writing Your Resilience podcast, where I dig into key writing issues with the two trauma-informed editors I'm training, Kristin Sancken and Lynn, Shattuck. In our first conversation, we explore metaphors, what they are, how to craft them, and how to recognize the ones that truly sing on the page. Let's go ahead and dive in. Welcome to Writing Your Resilience, the podcast for writers who want to write and live the story that sets them free. I'm your host, Lisa Cooper Ellison, a writer, transformational and trauma-informed coach, story alchemist, and fellow traveler on the winding road of healing and creativity. Each week, I'll share tools, practices, and conversations that will help you let go of what no longer serves you as you create stories that change lives, especially your own. Together, we'll explore how to trust your creative voice, support your mental health and resilience, work with your nervous system and unique design, and stay connected to your deepest calling as a writer, even when life gets messy. It's time, my friends, to write and live the story that sets you free. I'm honored to walk that journey alongside you, one story and one episode at a time. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of the Writing Your Resilience podcast. I am so glad that you are here. And I am so glad today because we are going to do something a little different. We're starting a new segment of the podcast, and I would love to hear what you think. Please be sure to put some comments on YouTube, and then you can also text the podcast to let me know what you think. But this is the new segment. We are going to do an Editors Roundtable with my two guests, who are the editors that I am working with and supervising to teach them how to be trauma-informed, and that is Kristin Sancken and Lynn, Shattuck. So I'm going to give them an opportunity here in a second to tell you a little more about themselves, and then we are going to dive into an issue that can supercharge your writing life, and it's something that so many writers struggle with, and that is the issue of metaphors. So we're going to have a deep conversation around it where we're going to define them in a variety of different ways. We're going to talk about our specific writing practices, what we do to help us not just create them, but to know when we've got one that's really, really good. And then we're going to share some exercises that you can use too. And we'll also talk about the struggles we have along the way that make it challenging. So that's what's going to happen in today's episode. And so before we get to our conversation, let me go ahead and introduce Kristin and Lynn. So Kristin, I am going to start with you. Tell us a little about yourself and what you do.
Hi, I'm Kristin Thomas Sancken. You'll have to forgive me for these ridiculous headphones and this speaker. These were my pandemic thing that I bought to help make meetings better, and they're hideous, but they work really well. So I was born in Panama. I was raised in Mexico. I came of age in Minnesota, and I now live in Virginia. So a big part of my life has been just moving all over and being really international. And my writing in the past has earned awards and publications in The Guardian, Huffington Post, Columbia Journal, to name a few. And I have a Substack called Sanctuary of the Holy Others, which allows people who have been marginalized from society and the church to tell their faith stories, especially people who have been hurt. Yeah, and right now I've been working with Lisa for the last year or so, training in to learn how to be a trauma-informed editor. I have a degree in social work and a degree in writing, and this has been a place where I've really enjoyed the growth and enjoyed getting to know other people's stories and helping them to release those stories into the world.
And I just want to say it has been an absolute joy to work with you, Kristin, and your headphones are fabulous. I feel like I'm on the Starship Enterprise, that you're getting ready to command us all, or that you are some sort of superhero. So listeners, if you have not seen these, you have to go to YouTube so you can see these fabulous headphones, and then you can decide if you want to get some too. Well, thank you, Kristin. And also, the one last thing I'll just say as a shout out to Kristin is that the people who have worked with Kristin have emailed me to tell me how much they've enjoyed working with her and how insightful she's been. So you can be one of those people by emailing me, or I can put you directly in contact with her because she is looking for new clients. And that leads to Lynn, who is newer to our little group, but also just as talented. And I am just as excited to work with her. So, Lynn, can you tell us a little about you?
Sure. I am a writer, editor, and now coach. I am a co-editor of an anthology on sibling loss that just came out in June called Loss of a Lifetime. I live in Maine and I grew up in Alaska. I think those are the basics.
And what happened earlier this year that was huge that I was also a part of, but you were the shepherd that took it to the finish line.
The anthology.
Yes.
Yeah, in June. Yeah, in June we launched the anthology Loss of a Lifetime. Grieving siblings share stories of love, loss, and hope.
And Lynn is very humble, but I just want to plug this because it's such an incredible anthology. And when we had the reading, I think there were 80 people at a virtual reading, which is huge to have so many people. And they would not have been there had it not been for Lynn and all of the hard work she put into this anthology, along with Allison Shelton and the main crew who were organizing and preparing and creating websites and all of the things that need to happen when you are publishing a book. So glad to have you both here. And so let's go ahead and get started with our conversation. And this is a conversation on metaphors. And the reason I chose it as our first conversation is because you are both metaphor superheroes. I know this because I've known you both for quite a while and I've got a chance to read your work, which is gorgeous. And so we are going to put a few links in the show notes to some of the essays that you have written so people can enjoy your work. But let's start with this conversation around what is a metaphor. And I'm going to begin by just sharing the literal definition, right? Because I think that's a good place to start. And then we're going to talk about, well, what is it for you, right? Because these dictionary definitions, they're helpful, but they're not always enough. So, from the dictionary, a metaphor is a figure of speech in which a word or phrase is applied to an object or action to which it is not literally applicable. I can't even say that word, applicable. So, what in the world does that mean? How do you see a metaphor?
When I was thinking of this question, I was sitting down and I was trying to write it down without a dictionary, like the definition of it. And what I came up with was pretty similar. I came up with using objects, ideas, and surroundings to convey deeper truths of a story that helps to deepen and expand its meaning.
I love that. What did you do to think about the answer, Lynn?
I also avoided using a dictionary. And for me, what I came up with was a metaphor is a way of creating a connection that in some way allows us to deepen our understanding of a situation, can be symbolic.
I love both of those. And it intersects with the one that I actually created because I wanted to start with the dictionary definition because people always like something that feels official as a starting point. And for me, I see it as a container, right? It's a container for that which is difficult to express and a way to make the ineffable and the difficult to describe concrete. Right. So when we're talking about feelings, we're talking about spiritual experiences, we're talking about anything that is difficult to touch. Metaphor allows us to feel and engage with it. And that's why it is such a powerful part of the writing process.
Yeah, I think it's really true. One of the things when I was preparing for this podcast and thinking about metaphors was I kept bumping into simile. I kept bumping into this is like this as this, and thinking that metaphors are a much deeper version of simile. Simile is sort of off the cuff, usually within a sentence, but a metaphor is often repeated. The places I think of where metaphor shows up the strongest is in short form, so in poetry and song lyrics, because the writer has to communicate a lot with fewer words. And so using metaphor creates a way for the listener or the reader to connect deeper because they can connect it to an experience they've already had that they may not have the words for, but they know the feeling.
I love that. What would you like to add to that, Lynn?
I just was thinking that metaphors can also be kind of a way of connecting the unconscious to the conscious. We dream in metaphors in a lot of ways. So I think metaphors are kind of already woven into our humanity, and it can be a way to connect the conscious and the unconscious.
I love what you just shared because two exercises are immediately coming to me to help people write better metaphors. And so, one thing you can do is you can record your dreams, right? When you are writing about your dreams, you are capturing the metaphors that are organically available for you. And then you can be really curious about how they relate to the rest of your life. How is this, I don't know, storm that shows up in the middle of your dream related to some experience that you're having, or some emotion, so that you can use that. Another thing you can do is to start writing similes, right? Similes are comparisons that use the words like or as, and they can be a great starting point for figuring out what metaphors might work for your writing. And then how can you retool a sentence to get rid of that like or as, which is how you get closer to what a metaphor is. So there are two exercises that come directly from what you all just shared. And so let's talk a little bit about your favorite metaphors. What are some metaphors that you hold on to or that you keep going back to again and again that help anchor you in this process?
It was easier for me to think of my least favorite metaphors than it is to think about my favorite ones. One of the ones that came to mind was when I read Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. It's an old book. I remember we read that in high school, and my English teacher was trying to explain to us that there's this bucket in one of the scenes where the bucket has holes in it. And she was trying to explain that this bucket was a metaphor for Africa, that Africa is this place where you put resources into and that just falls out. And I, having grown up in developing world, was like, that is not the metaphor at all. Like, I was so upset by the way she had taken it. And I was arguing with her in this English class, which is like frowned upon in Catholic school. And I was saying, like, well, how do we know that that's the metaphor? How do we know it's not just a bucket? Like, maybe he just wrote about a rusty bucket because that's the kind of bucket that was available in where they were. And like, how do we know the writer's intention for metaphor when we're reading? And so it's easy for me to come up with like a bunch of examples of like metaphors I don't like, because I think that they've been taken out of context, or I think sometimes we as readers feed in our own background into a metaphor instead of really understanding what the writer is bringing to it. Because everyone approaches a book or a story with their own story, right? So they're all interacting with what they know, what their background is. And I think some of the best metaphors are the ones that feel most universal, that the most people can tap into and understand. And when I think of that, there's a book that I just finished that I really loved, and it was called The Lion Women of Tehran. And it was about the Shirzan, which is an Iranian word that means lion women. And throughout the book, it's a sustained metaphor that every time you see a lion, the way that the author describes the lion, it's clear that she's also describing the women this way. And one of the examples was they're sitting in front of the New York Public Library, which is a big, big library. It has 2 lion statues, and it describes how these lions are the arbiters of knowledge in Manhattan, that they stand there making sure everyone has access to knowledge. And as a reader, because you know the topic of the book is the Lion Women of Tehran, you start to tune in, you start to be like, oh, we're back to talking about lions. And these are different lions. These are lions that are statues in front of a library. But we know that she's also talking about these women who are living in Tehran who are trying to fight for access to education. And throughout the book, that keeps appearing, but they never directly say this woman is a lion, right? But you can tell by the sustained discussion of the Shirzan, of lions, of the way that women lion take care of their pride, like that it is a sustained metaphor throughout the book. And it was really well done. And I feel like that is an example of a metaphor that as a reader, you can really understand what the writer's trying to say. And part of that is because I come to the book as a woman, right? I come to the book as someone who has experienced discrimination as a woman and who can identify with these feelings of needing to be fierce and protective for the sake of my children or for the sake of future generations, which is what this book is all about. That was a metaphor that really did work for me. Were there metaphors that worked for you guys?
I was going to use the example of Christie Tate's group, I believe, and this is another extended metaphor like Kristin was talking about. I think she uses the image of an unscored heart at the beginning, and then kind of her goal is to have a scored heart, which is to kind of experience the messiness of life. And she uses that throughout the book. I believe I heard that she added that somewhat late in her writing process. And I just really liked that idea that you could take something like that, take some sort of symbol that was resonant and use it as a way to show the motion that happens in a narrative and the change that happens.
I love that you just shared that. And I'm going to point out a couple of things that you just brought to the table, both of you, and then I'm going to share my favorites. So, yeah, one way to discover metaphors and to really point them out is to figure out what you don't like. Anything that you don't like, that resistance point can be a really great place to start. But what you also want to look at is what is repeating. There's a metaphor that shows up once that helps you understand something, but then there's an overarching metaphor that creates resonance. And a good metaphor is going to change over time as you interact with it. And the ways that we interact with these metaphors are going to change based on who we are, right? So when we're thinking about metaphors, both when we're readers, we want to think about who am I as I come to a book? Like, what are all of my identities? And how are my identities intersecting or interacting with these words? And then what will I pick up from it? But also, you want to think about that as the writer, right? So, what metaphors are going to rise up organically from me as the writer based on who I am? And so, those are some of the things you can think about when it comes to metaphor, because yes, the best ones are not explicitly shared, just like you were talking about, in the book that you read, Kristin. So I want you listeners to really think about this in your life, because metaphors aren't just for writing, right? We want to use them. And so many of you who are listening are actually writers. You're trying to get books published, but not all of you. Some of you are just writing to figure out how you think or how the world works for you, or you're looking for ways to cope. So the example that I brought is a very personal example for me. And this is from a book of poetry by Michael Osedal, or I think his name's Osedal. And if I'm saying it wrong, please correct me, someone. And so if you're on YouTube, you can see the cover of this book, and it's Our Double Time. And I met Michael Osedal when I was in Ireland back in 2000. He was a poet, and I can't even remember the poetry house that we met him at, but I had just graduated with my bachelor's degree, and 3 years earlier, my brother died by suicide. He was also grieving something, and it was from grief that he wrote this book called Our Double Time. And so this is a double entendre around double time. Can be a way that music works, right? So the quickening that happens in a piece of music, but it's also the experience we have when we are grieving, that there is a way that we are living things again, or living things in a different way as a result of experiencing grief. And so there were so many beautiful ways that we could explore these words. And he read so much of this, and it was really wonderful. And then he wrote, "For Lisa, enjoy your double time." And so we had this long conversation around people we had lost and what that was like, and the preciousness of experiencing life again with new meaning. And so this book has been a metaphor in and of itself, right? It's been on my bookshelf for a long time. I'm also a huge fan of Hope is a Thing with Feathers by Emily Dickinson. It's just a short line. And when life gets tough, it's something that I come back to. Another one is It's Always Darkest Before the Dawn, which I know is a huge cliche. And what I can say is, when it comes to coping with life, sometimes these things, which are cliche, can be okay. Do we want to infuse our writing with them? No. We want to find these fresh new ways to work on things, but we want to figure out how we can engage with metaphor in different ways in our lives, because the more you're engaging with metaphor, not just on the page, but out in life, the easier it's going to be for you to find them and to write ones that are really fresh for you. And that leads to the next question I wanted to ask the two of you is, you're both writers, right? We're in the trenches, working on projects, trying to figure these things out, and you're both masters at creating metaphor. So when you are writing, I want you to think about, it's just a writing time and you're sitting down. What are you doing? Because I think that listeners sometimes think that we're all like, metaphor, what are you? Let me come up with this perfect idea right now, and it will be brilliant and wonderful, and everyone will bow to my prowess. And that is not how writing works. So Tell us a little about your writing process and how metaphors show up, and I will share a bit of mine as well.
This was a really hard question for me. I don't know. What about you? Were you able to answer this question easily, Lynn? I reflected on it for a long time. So I want to hear Lynn's answer first, and then I'll riff off of that.
And I will say, Lynn, to get you off the hook, if you feel like it was just as hard for me, pass the baton back. And since I'm the one that asked it, I will take responsibility for answering the question.
I think it's funny, Kristin, because it is a hard one for me to answer also, but I think the answer is an applicable one. I think it's about seeing connections and training yourself to see connections. So a lot of times it's actually not when I'm sitting down to write, but it's like I'm out in the world. My daughter thought this was a really obnoxious metaphor the other day, but we were driving up to her orthodontist appointment and she pointed out that someone had parked just really, really badly. And I said, well, I like to think of that as a metaphor that you don't know who was parked there before. You're just seeing the car that is on the line or whatever. You're not seeing an hour ago when someone else was parked there that caused them to park there. And she thought that was like incredibly obnoxious, but I was kind of proud of the metaphor.
I love it.
I do think that connection of like teaching yourself to think in connections, because what I wrote down was, I think it's some of the best metaphors I've ever written is when I write a cliche first and I know I shouldn't write a cliche. And then I have to really require my imagination to make that fresh. So if it is, it's always darkest before the dawn, or it is what it is, or she's a gem. Like, what does that mean? Can you describe a gem in this situation? Why does a gem matter? Why is it valuable? To really dive into the sensory sensations as well as like a deep description that overcomes that cliche and that takes something that everyone would understand, but maybe not take the time to think about, into something that they have to think about a little bit more deeply. And I think actually kids sometimes are naturally really good at metaphors. Watching my kids come up with metaphors, like they love to play this game around the dinner table where they're like, if you were a dessert, what would you be? If you were an office appliance, what would you be? And those are all metaphors, right? And they love doing this. They love imagining every character in a book as a different kind of chip, like, and you're like, okay. And so it is that sort of loose association, the imagination that has to come in to connect disparate ideas.
So I'm going to have your kids over. Kristin and I are in the same town so that we can play that game, because I play that game with my husband all the time and drive him bananas because he's like, I don't want to play that. Stop asking me these questions. But I think that can be a great way to engage with it, is just ask yourself these questions and to think about the container, right? So I do a lot of work with writers on the hermit crab form, which is where you are taking your experience and applying it to a specific form of writing that you wouldn't normally think of. So you might have your experience as a police blotter or a recipe or something else. And so when you are taking your story and imposing a container or a structure around it, that can be an easy way to organically find metaphors. But just asking yourself this question, if you were X, what would you be, will tell you so much. I personally think in visuals. So whenever I'm sitting down to write, I will do a couple of different things. One, before I start writing, I will center myself, do some meditation. I will notice if there are any images coming up for me, especially objects. And I learned that when I took a mindful writing course back in 2013 at the University of Virginia. That was actually what we did. There were a whole bunch of objects on a table. You had to pick one up and then you had to use it in a story, or you had to, figure out what the story of it was. So that's something that you can do. So I'll see if there's an image. And then sometimes I will just start making those comparisons, those likes and ases. I'll be like, it was like this, it was like that. And a lot of them are going to be garbage, especially in the beginning. And so that's one thing you want to allow for, is the freedom to write trash. And so we don't always give ourselves permission to do that. That is one of the reasons why I created the Ditch Your Inner Critic Now masterclass, because I wanted to give you all some concrete strategies to help get away from your inner critic, which tells you that what you're doing is wrong. So if you want a copy of that, you can go ahead and go to the show notes, just click on the link and you will get that for free. So yeah, we want to do those things that free ourselves up, and imagine warming ourselves up, right? Warming yourself up is a metaphor for the process so that you can be loose, especially in early drafts, and just get things down so that you can get to the final stage, which is figuring out when something works. And so that's one of the last questions that I'm going to ask you all. And then I have something else that we're going to talk about that is not on the list of questions I shared with you, because I find that to be important. And so, how do you know when you've come up with a really good metaphor?
For me, it's when I start to daydream about it. I like what Lynn said about connecting the subconscious to the conscious. Like if I'm driving, I mean, both Lynn and I are parents and we're in active parenting right now. So I'm spending a lot of time driving kids to and from school, to and from appointments, to and from sports practices and band practice and everything. And I find that if I'm doing those drives and I'm thinking about the metaphor, I'm like, that's it. That's the one. If it keeps developing and I'm even in my sort of daydream time, I'm like, oh, and here's where I could take it. And here's where I could take it. And here's where I could take it. I wrote a poem that won a first prize at the University of Virginia that literally was just me. It was written while I was driving to pick up my kids from stuff. And it was about a parrot that was dying of strangulation. And so I was doing all these plays on like O2, like this idea of oxygen, and A2 Brute, and it was just like linking and linking and linking and linking. And I was like, this is it. It's this hook of oxygen being the thing that keeps us alive. That's the metaphor. And it's also this idea that like oxygen was discovered by science, and that science is often this helter-skelter thing that kind of throws out. And that's kind of what I was playing with in this poem. And it was one of those things where I turned in the poem, I was like, this is trash. I think this is total trash. And then it won first prize. And I was like, what? So I do think that sometimes you don't even know for yourself what's good, but you know what's fun and what's playful and what's getting your mind going in a new way. And to take some risks like that, I think that is important in writing. And sometimes you miss. Sometimes you take a risk and, I could have turned that poem in and never heard back from the committee. Instead, I got a first prize, and I was like, what in the world? But it was because it was just fun for me. It was fun to be thinking about this as I was driving around and thinking about all of the different ways that oxygen plays into science and the way that we think about our world and the way that we think about how the human body and animals function. Like, it was just like really playful. And I think that that is a really successful metaphor, is when it feels fun.
I love that.
I love that too, Kristin. I love the idea of being expansive with it and enjoying it, having fun. I also think, and this is not generally like the advice I would give somebody, but I do think it helps to kind of test out your metaphors and have like a safe writing group or editor coach that can kind of let you know if that resonates with them. I do think sometimes something can resonate for us really strongly and it might not translate for other people. And by just passing that by some people that you trust, I think you can gather information on whether it's working or not.
And I do think it matters who the voice is. So like I wrote a piece that was from my childhood voice, and it was from when I was 8 years old. And the metaphor I was trying to use was a scene from The Shining. And my writing coach was like, there's no way an 8-year-old would know that reference. It's those sorts of things. Like, you have to pay attention to who's saying it. So if it's you as a child, if you're writing fiction, if it's a character, would this character know this metaphor? Would they use this metaphor? Would this make sense given the character and the context and the time, right? Like if you're writing a book about a historical novel about the 1800s, you're not going to use a reference from The Shining. Like, it's just not going to make sense, right? Yeah. And I hadn't put those things together until my writing coach was like, you can't use this metaphor here because this child would not know that metaphor. They would not see the world in that way. And so to dive back into what is it that my 8-year-old self would see this as, that would make sense to her. And it strengthened the piece a lot because it really made you see through the eyes of a child what something that was scary would feel like.
Yeah, those are some really great points. So making sure that you're thinking about who is your character, right? What is that point of view? And is the metaphor that you're creating authentic to that point of view? And allowing for fun as you create them, right? So when Kristin was talking about her process, it was passive, right? She wasn't forcing the metaphor to happen. She was driving down the street and playing around in her head. So passivity, like allowing yourself to go for walks, being in the shower, other places where you're not actually at your writing desk is often where we come up with these. And also allowing for play and for fun is so important. And I love what you said, Lynn, about the importance of feedback, because sometimes we lose perspective and we don't understand what is actually good in our own writing. Again, that inner critic can get in our way, and then we might think, oh, this sucks and I should just throw it away, when in fact it's absolute gold. And I have seen that again and again. In fact, last week I was in a class and someone shared something that was absolutely amazing. It was an incredible metaphor for so many things. It's still sticking with me. And when I talked to the person later, they thought it sucked and they were so worried that it was like cliche or banal, or add your label of negativity to it, and they thought that's what it was, and it certainly wasn't. So when you get feedback from a writing group, from a coach, from someone else, there are two things that they can do. Number one, they can point out the strengths in your writing that you can't see, and a really good coach is also going to help you recalibrate by learning how to identify what works really well in your own writing, so that you can go back to those moments when it was working, when it was fun, when things just seemed to be downloading, and go, pause. How did that feel in your body? What was it that told you this was good enough to put on the page? And so the more you can think about those things, the stronger your work is going to be. And I'll just share this playful moment. This is an unpublished poem, but now y'all are encouraging me to come back to it, and I need to maybe send this out. I wrote this poem a good long while ago. This was, I think, 3 years after my brother's death. I was in this advanced poetry class, and I remembered after he died, my mom had made these cookbooks for the three of us. And my brother had had his for like a year and a half before he died. And I found it in his room. And on it was a single fingerprint that was there, like in the flower on the cover. And it was this precious moment of like, these are the artifacts that mean so much to us. And also, this is the impression and the imprint someone makes on us. And that's what I explore in this poem. And I knew it was a good metaphor just because I felt it in my body. And then, of course, I just like tucked my poems away and didn't do anything more with them because it just felt precious to me. But now I'm feeling like I need to bring that back. So, yeah, there are all of these different ways that we can think about metaphor, come up with metaphors, and play around with metaphors that don't have to be this serious, dodgy, literary criticism or fancy stuff that we're doing. It's just play. It's just figuring out, how do we make the unconscious conscious? How do we connect to those things that are difficult for us to see and feel and understand? And that leads me to the last thing that we're going to talk about. So, as I've talked about before, I am an Akashic Records reader. I am working to become an Akashic Records healer and guide. And so I asked the master's teachers and loved ones, what else should we talk about? And they said, we need to talk about the metaphor of home. So, how does home show up for you, or what does home mean? And I'm going to go to my notebook because a lot of these messages come to me and I write them down. So I'm just going to write it down. What is home? Where is it? What does it feel like? And how is home a forgotten metaphor? I think that's the place where I really want to take us, is how is home a forgotten metaphor in your work? And what I want to say to both of you is that whatever comes to mind first is the right answer. So don't force yourself to come up with something brilliant or think like, damn, I got to come up with a thing. You don't.
Yeah, the first thing that came to my mind was home is where you do chores. Which might say a lot about like my current state of life. But I also think it's true in that like if you care about a place, you're willing to put effort into it. You know, like at school, for instance, at least most of the schools I went to, you weren't asked to vacuum the floors and like wipe off the boards. But at home, because you care about your place and because you care about being in a place that you feel good in, you're willing to treat it differently. And I think too, like here's a good metaphor that I really appreciate is thinking of my body as a home. I think I was raised in a family where for women in particular, your body was a showpiece and your body was meant to be beautiful and acceptable from the outside. And to think of your body as a home and to think of it as all of the things I need to do to keep my home running. Like I need to make sure I get the roof replaced every 30 years. And I need to make sure that I'm changing the water filters. And I'm like, and those are equivalent to like workouts and colonoscopies and like things that are not fun, but they're important to keep your home running, right? Like you need to do that in order to like really live in a comfortable home. And those weren't things that were communicated to me. When your body is a showpiece, when all it is for drive-by and for curb appeal, you don't have to invest in the roof. You don't have to change your water filters. You just have to make sure the flowers look nice and that like the windowsill is painted. But a real true home, a place where you want to spend a lot of time, you have to do those chores. You have to do the work that's difficult to make it comfortable in the long run. There's my metaphor of home.
I love that. And also public service announcement around colonoscopies. If you haven't scheduled yours, be sure to do so. And yes, please drink the prep.
Yeah.
So Lynn, what about you?
Kristin, that was really, really good. What came to me on this topic is that sometimes I think metaphors can appear to us and we don't always understand them until later. And the example I'm going to give is right after my dad died, I had this vision of what turned out to be basically like an inner child of mine. And it was really a powerful image. And I didn't understand it, but I'm like, okay, grief makes you kind of cuckoo and does weird stuff. And I realized it was probably a couple of years later that was like an invitation to come home to parts of myself that I hadn't explored in the past. So
I love it. And I also can say that I love that I get to know that inner child. And I can't wait for everyone else get to know her too. That's going to happen. It's coming. But in the meantime, I get to be the lucky recipient of all of that information. Yeah. And as I was sitting with this, and it was interesting that the master's teachers and loved ones gave this to me because home is a complicated place. I write about different things in my Substack, which would make you understand why it's a complicated place. And so this was the metaphor that just came to me as I was listening to all of you. It just like was like, boop, here it is. Home is a hole I fall into so I can feel the walls.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know where that's taking me, but I'm going to trust that it's going to help me understand this concept of home, which is complicated, right? So what are those walls like when you can't see them? So what are the unconscious things you bring to the table and what is lurking there that is both maybe scary, but also beautiful, right? Because in the darkness, there can be so much wonder as well. It's just we don't always bring that to the table. And so this has been so much fun. Listeners, if you've enjoyed this, there's two things that I'd like you to do. Either text the podcast or put a comment on YouTube. And I'll just say, if you put the comment on YouTube, that helps with the algorithm. So we'd be hugely grateful as to what you got out of this. And also, if there is a topic that you would like us to tackle, let us know. And some of you have been sharing some things you'd like me to talk about. And that's been really helpful because this is a podcast for you. And the more you share, the more we co-create this process. So we are going to wrap up. First, I'm going to say thank you, Kristin. Thank you, Lynn, for now, because you're going to be back. We're going to do this again. And for all of you, what I would like to say is just trust the process. Understand that these metaphors that are right for you, for your life, for your writing, exist in you right now. And your job is simply to relax and allow them to come forward. And they will come forward in whatever way is going to serve you best if you just make yourself curious and just allow yourself to be open. And when you are open and when you are curious and when you allow for anything to happen, you can write and live the story that sets you free. And that's what this whole process is about. So thank you so much for listening, for being here. We are so grateful. Until next time, keep believing in your story because it matters to you and to the world. That's it for today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about Lynn or Kristin, please see the show notes for this episode. But before you go, I would love it if you would text the show if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or leave a comment on YouTube with an answer to one of these two questions. 1, what is your favorite metaphor? And 2, what would you like the editors to tackle next? We would be so honored to hear from you. And speaking of your feedback, I'd like to give a shout out to Edhara Morales, Stephanie Shaffron, Alara Paragas, and Doreen Francis for texting the show and sharing your responses to my episode on pivoting. I'd also like to offer a shout out to Deborah Copperwood for her shout out on my episode with Ingrid Clayton, and Rivka French and Katie Rouse for your take on my episode on rest. And special shout out to Rivka, who also shared a request, which has led to an episode that I am in the process of recording. So listeners, I would love to hear from you too. And if you haven't had a chance to contact the podcast, please do so now, because your story matters. And when you work on it, you don't just change lives. You write the story that sets you free. And when you do that, you set everyone else free too. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. I couldn't do this podcast without your support. If you love this episode, here are 3 simple ways that you can keep this show thriving. 1, subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. 2, leave a 5-star review so others can find the show. 3, join my engaged dynamic community by signing up for the Writing Your Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Ditch Your Inner Critic, 5 tools to transform self-doubt into self-support. Until next time, remember that your story matters. As you write and connect with the truest, most authentic version, you become not just the writer, but the person you're meant to be. And that, my friends, is the real freedom writing can offer.